Today, as the day closed outside, I wrote this story thinking about you. She is one of those stories of prosperity that doesn't start with wealth, but with silence, with small choices, and with the courage to reprogram the way of thinking even when everything seems to go wrong. Before we start, can I ask you something? If these stories have kept you company, subscribe to the channel, because here, every night is an invitation to mental reprogramming of wealth with words that calm and ideas that awaken. And if sleep hasn't arrived yet, tell me here in the comments, what was the lightest thought you had today? Sometimes a simple idea is already a seed of change right there. I read everything with affection, and I answered too. Now take a deep breath. Today's story begins where almost no one pays attention, in the silent doubt of someone who thought about stopping, but decided to take just one more step, because prosperity, sometimes, it starts when we change the tone of our own inner voice. In a quiet village that seemed to exist just outside the rush of time, there lived a man who spent his days moving gently from one moment to the next. He had no reason to hurry and no place he was required to be. He lived in a small cottage with walls the color of sun-faded straw and windows that caught the morning light in soft golden ribbons. His days began with the quiet song of birds and the distant murmur of the river that curled lazily around the edges. If the village he had learned to listen to the rhythm of the earth rather than the noise of the world. He had learned that when you slow down, time stretches like a ribbon, and within that ribbon you can find the seeds of dreams that most people are too hurried to notice. He would wake to the soft creak of the wooden beams above his head, the faint scent of the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, and the gentle warmth of the sunlight that always seemed to wait for him, never rushing him out of sleep. He would breathe in slowly and feel the air fill him as though the universe itself was pouring a soft, golden light into his lungs. He would rise and step onto the old wooden floorboards, which spoke back to him in whispers, and he would stand there for a long moment, looking out the window at the fields that stretched out to the edge of the horizon. Every morning, the fields glowed in a different shade of green or gold, depending on the way the sun kissed them. The world outside his window felt like a living painting, each blade of grass a small brushstroke from the hand of something far greater than himself, and he would feel a quiet gratitude, a gratitude that filled him in the places where worry could never enter. He had learned that life had its own pulse, its own whispers, and if you slowed down enough to hear them, the world would start to speak to you in a language that only your heart could understand. He would walk slowly through his small home, touching the edges of furniture he had built himself, running his fingers over the grain of the wood and remembering the patient hours spent crafting them. There was a table in the corner that held a small vase of dried wildflowers. The flowers were brittle but beautiful, like memories. That time could never erase. He would pause there every morning, as though the flowers had a story to tell him, and he had all the time in the world to listen. He would step outside, then, into the soft morning air, and feel the coolness of dew still. Clinging to the earth, he loved the way the earth smelled in the morning, as though the night had left behind secrets, in the soil secrets that only someone who listened could ever receive. He would take a slow walk along the path that led toward the river. The path was lined with stones, smoothed by the steps of generations. Each stone held a story of someone who had passed this way, carrying dreams, fears, laughter, or silence, and he felt as if those quiet stories walked with him. He reached the river and sat on the old wooden dock, letting his feet dangle above. The water, the river, was never in a hurry. It slipped around the bend with a grace that only something timeless could hold, and as he watched the water move, he felt as if it was carrying away the last bits of noise that still clung to his mind. Sometimes he would speak softly to the river, telling it dreams he had not yet said aloud. He believed that if you whispered a dream to the river would carry it too. The sea would lift it to the sky, and the sky would hand it back to the earth when it was ready to bloom. The villagers thought he was quiet, maybe too quiet, but he was not lonely. He was simply living at a different rhythm, one that allowed him to notice things others missed, like the way light curved around a leaf, or the way a breeze could carry the scent of possibility across an open field. He had not yet discovered how much this slow, quiet way of living would open doors in his life, doors that most people never saw because they were too busy running past them. One morning, as he sat by the river, he noticed something strange. At first, he thought it was only a trick of the water, a reflection of light that danced where it did not belong. But as he leaned closer, he saw it was something else, a small shimmering object caught between the reeds. It was no larger than his hand, and yet it glowed as though the morning sun had chosen it as its secret keeper. He reached into the cool water and lifted it gently. It was a smooth, polished stone, unlike any he had ever seen. Its surface was etched with delicate lines that seemed to form a pattern, almost like a map or a message. He held it in his palm and felt a warmth that was not from the sun. It was as if the stone itself was alive, quietly breathing and whispering in a voice too soft for words. He sat there for a long time with the stone in his hand, watching the river drift past and the world remain perfectly still. Around him, he felt as if the moment had stretched into eternity, a soft invitation from life itself. He did not know why he felt it, but he sensed that this small stone was the beginning of something something that would move as slowly as the river, but as powerfully as the tides. He closed his eyes and listened to the river, to the air, to the quiet hum that seemed to come from somewhere inside himself. And in that silence, he heard the faintest echo, a message he could not yet understand, but could feel in the bones of his being. And so his journey began, not with noise or fireworks, but with the quiet discovery of a single stone, and the sense that life was whispering to him, that it was ready to give him more, if only he would keep listening. The days that followed were slow, like honey dripping from the edge of a spoon, and each moment seemed to hold its own quiet weight. The man kept the stone with him, always, not because he feared losing it, but because it felt like the stone wanted to see the world through his eyes. He would place it on the windowsill in the morning, where the sun would rest its light upon it, as though the two were speaking in a language he could not yet understand. At night he would hold it in his hand, while he listened to the distant lull of the river, and sometimes he swore he could feel the stone's rhythm align with his heartbeat, a soft, pulsing reminder that something within him was waking. The villagers began to notice a new stillness about him, a stillness that felt like the air just before a summer storm, heavy with the scent of change. He did not speak much of the stone or of what he felt, because he had learned long ago that not every secret is meant to be shared before it ripens. Instead, he let the days carry him slowly toward understanding. One evening, when the sun had slipped low and the sky had turned into a soft wash of lavender and gold, he walked to the river again. The path was the same, and yet it felt different, as though the air itself leaned closer to listen. He sat on the dock and let the tips of his toes touch the water, which was warm from the day, but cool beneath the surface. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, and in that quiet he felt the stone grow warm in his hand. It was not sudden, but slow, like the way dawn creeps across a sleeping village. He opened his eyes and saw something he had never seen before, small threads of light rising from the river, like whispers of mist, but golden and soft. They drifted upward, curling and swaying as if carried by invisible hands. He blinked to see if it was a trick of the fading sun, but the lights remained shimmering in the air and slowly drifting toward the forest across the river. His heart did not race. It merely expanded with a calm curiosity, as if some part of him had expected this all along. He stood and followed the lights across the old bridge that groaned under his weight. The boards were slick with evening dew, and the smell of moss rose from below. With each careful step, the lights moved ahead like patient guides, never rushing him, never letting him fall behind. He entered the forest and felt the change immediately. The air here was thick with the perfume of pine and damp earth. And something else, something older, that hummed in the spaces between the trees. The lights floated deeper into the woods, and he followed them until the sound of the river faded, and all he could hear was the soft crunch of his footsteps on the forest floor and the slow, steady beat of his own heart. He arrived at a clearing he had never seen before. The grass here glowed faintly as though the moon had brushed it with silver, and in the center stood an ancient oak, its branches reaching out like the arms of a giant guardian. He felt the weight of the moment, the sense that he was standing in a place where time had stopped, or perhaps where time had never truly begun. The light circled the oak, and then, one by one, sank into the soil. At its roots, disappearing into the earth, the man approached slowly and knelt at the base of the tree. He placed the stone on the ground, and for a moment nothing happened. Then a soft vibration rose through the soil, up into his hands and knees, and into his chest. It was as if the earth itself was speaking in a voice too deep for words. He closed his eyes and listened, and in that stillness he heard the first clear thought rise in his mind, like a bubble breaking the surface of a pond. "You are ready," it said. He opened his eyes, but no one was there. Only the tree, the moonlight, the faint hum of life in the air, and the stone, which now seemed to glow faintly from within. He picked it up and felt a surge of warmth spread through his fingers, up his arm and into his heart. He did not feel afraid. He felt seen, as though the world had been waiting for him to notice its quiet invitations, and now that he had answered, they would not stop. He stayed in the clearing for what felt like hours, or perhaps only minutes. Time had a way of bending here, folding in on itself like a soft blanket. He could not say how long he remained, only that when he finally walked back to the village, the stars were sharp against the sky, and the air carried the scent of wildflowers, even though it was long past their bloom. That night, he slept more deeply than he ever had, and in his dreams, he saw the river carrying golden threads to the sea lifting them to the clouds, and the clouds letting them fall as gentle rain upon the fields of his village. When he woke, he felt a new rhythm in his chest, as though a soft drumbeat was guiding him toward something he could not yet name. He rose and carried the stone to the window where the morning sun was waiting. It caught the light and sent it scattering across the walls, and for a moment his cottage was full of tiny suns, spinning and dancing in the air. He smiled, a small, quiet smile, and whispered, "Thank you," though he could not say exactly to whom or to what, but he felt in his bones that someone or something had heard him, and that was enough. Each day after, he would walk to the clearing. When the village still slept, he would sit at the base of the oak and place the stone in his lap, and he would breathe slowly, letting his thoughts drift like leaves on the river, and always the same soft thought would rise in his mind. "You are ready," and with each repetition, he began to believe it, not with loud certainty, but with the quiet knowing that blooms in the heart and needs no proof. He began to notice changes in his days. Small at first, like the way birds seemed to linger near his window, or the way wildflowers sprouted where none had been the season before villagers would greet him, and he would feel warmth rise in his chest, not just from their words, but from a sense that he was part of something larger, something soft and golden that was weaving itself through his life. He had no plan, no map, only the stone, the tree, and the river, and yet he felt as though he was walking a path that had been waiting for him since the beginning of time. One evening, he returned to the clearing and found the moonlight thicker than usual, as though the night itself was watching. He sat cross-legged with the stone in his hands and felt the world grow very still. He whispered to the air, "I am ready," and the wind stirred as of tea in answer, carrying the scent of pine and promise through the branches above. He closed his eyes and let the forest hold him in its quiet embrace, and for the first time he felt that the stone was not simply an object. It was a key that would open doors he had yet to imagine, and the first door was already opening inside his heart. Days passed in a rhythm that felt less like the ticking of a clock and more like the breathing of the earth itself, slow, steady, and infinite. The man's life became a gentle cycle of waking with the sun, walking to the river, listening to the whispers of the water, and then making his way to the clearing where the ancient oak waited. Each morning he would feel a pull like an invisible thread, guiding him to sit at the base of the tree with a stone warm in his hand. It had become a part of him, an extension of his own heartbeat. He noticed that when he closed his eyes, the world became vast and quiet. And in that vastness, small thoughts would drift toward him, not in words, but in feelings. Soft pulses of knowing, like ripples moving across a still pond. One morning, as he sat in the clearing, the air held a heaviness that felt like expectation. The leaves barely stirred, though the wind should have touched them. The forest seemed to be holding its breath. He placed the stone against his chest and listened to the faint thrum of his heart, and in that moment he felt the first true whisper, not from the stone or the tree, or the air, but from somewhere deeper, a place within himself that he had never touched before. It said, "The world is waiting," and then the forest exhaled. The leaves rustled, the branches swayed, and the scent of pine and earth wrapped around him like a soft shawl. He opened his eyes and saw movement on the edge of the clearing. A small fox with fur like burnished copper and eyes bright as amber, watching him. The fox did not run. Instead, it tilted its head as if curious, and then padded silently into the clearing, circling him once before lying down in the grass. And for the first time, spoke aloud in the clearing. "Hello," he said softly. The fox's ears flicked, but it made no move to leave. He felt no need to move closer, no need to claim or capture, only to share the stillness as the sun rose higher. The fox closed its eyes, and the man followed suit, letting himself drift into the warm hum of the day. When he opened them again, the fox was gone, but in its place, where it had lain, was a small tuft of fur, glinting gold in the sunlight. He picked it up and felt a warmth rush through his fingers into his heart. He placed it in his pocket alongside the stone, sensing they belonged together. He left the clearing, and as he walked back toward the village, he felt the path itself welcoming him. The air seemed lighter, the colors of the fields sharper, the distant sound of the river sweeter than it had ever been before. He began to notice that the world was speaking to him everywhere, in the soft arc of a bird's flight in the way. The clouds drifted into shapes that hinted at dreams he had not yet fully dreamed, in the laughter of children playing near the fields, which felt like bells ringing in some invisible cathedral. His heart began to open wider, and he realized that what he carried was no longer just a stone, but a key to the hidden language of life. The villagers noticed a subtle change in him, though they could not name it. They said his eyes seemed brighter, that his steps seemed lighter, that he moved as if guided by a secret melody. He did not speak of the oak or the fox or the golden tuft of fur. He knew the magic lived in its silence, and that speaking of it too soon might scatter it like smoke in the wind. One evening, as he watched the sun dissolve into the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, he felt a soft stirring inside him, a thought that rose like a feather caught in an updraft. It said, "Plant what you carry." He did not understand at first, but the thought stayed with him like a seed pressing gently against the walls of his mind. The next morning, he walked to the clearing, carrying the stone and the tuft of fur. He knelt at the base of the oak and pressed his hand into the soil. It was cool and damp and alive. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I am ready." Then he dug a small hollow with his fingers, placed the tuft of fur inside, and covered it with earth. When he opened his hand, the stone glowed faintly, as if in approval. He set it on the ground, and for a moment the air grew very still. Then a soft pulse rose through the soil, like a heartbeat echoing up his arms into his chest. He felt as if the earth had accepted his offering, and something had begun that could not be undone. The following days were filled with small, quiet miracles. He noticed new shoots of green pushing through the soil near the oak. He saw the fox again, watching from the trees, and he began to dream. In golden light dreams, where rivers became roads of shimmering threads, leading to places he had never seen. And yet, somehow new in his bones, he woke each morning with a sense of soft anticipation, as though the air itself was preparing a gift for him. He began to speak softly to the stone at night, telling it the things he had never told anyone, not his fears, not his hopes, but the spaces in between, the tender hesitations of the heart that have no names. And he felt the stone listening, holding each word. Like a sacred secret, one evening, a soft rain fell, and he went to the clearing, barefoot, letting the earth drink in the water, and the sky wash over his skin. The oak glistened under the raindrops, its bark dark and wet and alive. He leaned against it, closed his eyes, and felt the rain thread its way through his hair, down his neck, across his hands, and in that moment he understood the whisper, "Plant what you carry." It was not only the tuft of fur, it was every quiet thought, every gentle dream, every piece of gratitude he had held in his heart. They were seeds waiting for the soil of his life to welcome them. He felt a soft shift inside him, a turning of some hidden key, and he knew the whispers were leading him to a new door, one that opened not outward but inward. And though he could not yet see it, he felt its presence like the first breath of dawn touching the edges of night. The days stretched like golden threads woven into the tapestry of the season, and the man felt himself sinking into a rhythm that was no longer bound by the habits of the village or the ticking of any clock. It was as if his heart had become the sun, rising and setting in its own time. The oak became his silent companion, the river his gentle teacher, the fox his quiet reminder that the world listened when you moved with patience and care. He began to notice how the stone pulsed, not just with his heartbeat, but with the rhythms of the world around him. When the wind stirred through the forest, he felt it hum in his palm. When the rain fell, it carried a soft, tingling warmth through the stone into his fingers. When the first frost of the season touched the edges of the leaves, he felt a quiet stillness settle in his bones. One morning, he woke to the sound of the river singing, louder than usual. It was not the roar of flood or the chatter of rain, but a fullness like a choir carried on water. He followed the sound, barefoot, his feet sinking slightly into the damp earth. Each step cool and grounding. The mist rose from the surface of the river, curling like fingers around his legs, and the stone grew warm. In his pocket, he knelt at the edge and let his fingertips touch the water, which felt alive and electric like the first spark of something new. He closed his eyes and breathed deep, and in that stillness, he heard it, not in words, but in a pulse that thrummed through his chest and echoed in the water plant. More, he opened his eyes and looked around. The riverbank, nothing had changed, and yet everything had he began to gather what the earth offered him, fallen. Leaves, twigs, smooth stones, feathers carried by the wind, he carried them all to the clearing and laid them in a circle. At the base of the oak, the fox appeared again, this time sitting just beyond the edge of the circle, its eyes reflecting the light. Like twin lanterns, he felt no fear, only a sense of deep reverence. He placed the stone in the center of the circle and knelt his hands on the soil, and the air shifted as though the forest had drawn closer. To watch, he whispered, "I am here," and in answer, the wind rose, stirring the leaves into a spiral. The circle of offerings glowed faintly, as though each leaf and feather carried its own memory of the sun. And then the earth pulsed again, a soft, slow rhythm that made his chest ache with something. Like joy in the days that followed, he began to live more in the forest than in the village. He woke with the first light, walked barefoot to the river, and then to the oak. He ate little, and yet he never felt hungry, as though the air itself had learned to feed him. He drank from the river and felt the water carry strength into his bones. He lay in the grass and watched the sky change colors and shapes, and he felt himself changing with it. There was a day when the first snow arrived, falling in soft, slow spirals that melted the moment they touched his skin. He walked into the forest as the snow deepened, the world growing quieter with each layer, and he reached the clearing to find the oak crowned in white like an ancient king. The circle of offerings was buried now, and yet the air still held its hum. He sat at the base of the oak, the stone warm in his hands, and he closed his eyes, letting the snow land on his face, melt and slide into his collar. He felt himself drift, and in that drift, he saw a vision, not sharp or bright, but soft and golden. He saw the roots of the oak stretching deep into the earth, weaving with other roots, forming a network that pulsed with light, like veins, carrying the breath of the world. He saw rivers running, like silver threads, across the land, connecting forests, mountains, and valleys. He saw himself not as separate, but as part of that vast, quiet pulse, and in that moment he understood that the whispers were not coming from outside. They were rising from the same place where the roots and rivers and sky met inside him. He opened his eyes, and the forest seemed sharper, every branch etched with meaning, every flake of snow a small, perfect gift. He whispered, "Thank you," to the air, to the earth, to the silent web of life that held him, and the forest seemed to sigh in reply. In the weeks that followed, he began to notice the world around him bending gently in response to his presence. The villagers came to him quietly, asking for his thoughts on planting, on weather, on when to harvest. He would close his eyes and listen, and though he never claimed knowledge, he spoke what rose in his heart, and always it seemed to be true. They began to call him lucky or blessed, but he knew it was not luck. It was listening. One morning, the fox came closer than ever before. It sat beside him at the oak and pressed its warm body against his leg. He reached down and felt its fur, soft and alive. And in that touch, he felt a surge of warmth that made his chest ache. The fox looked up at him, eyes deep as molten gold, and he swore. He heard a voice in his mind, soft and sure. The forest knows your name now. He stayed very still, letting the moment root in him, and the fox closed its eyes as if in trust. A light snow began to fall, catching on the fox's fur and his hair, and the forest hummed like a great sleeping heart as the seasons turned. He became part of that hum. More and more, he planted what he carried, not just in the soil, but in every action he took. He smiled at the children in the village and felt their laughter ripple into the air like seeds. He shared food with neighbors and felt the warmth travel outward. Like sunlight, he walked by the river and let his gratitude spill into the water, knowing it would carry that quiet offering to places he would never see. And slowly the man realized that the stone was no longer a separate thing. It was part of him, its warmth, his warmth, its hum, its pulse. The same as the pulse of the earth. And with that realization, a door opened. Though he did not see it, he felt it in the way. The world seemed to bow toward him, and in the way his heart expanded to meet it. Winter loosened its grip, slowly like a hand unclenching, and the first hints of spring crept into the forest. Soft green buds on branches, tawny shoots pushing bravely through the last patches of snow. The man felt the change in his bones before he saw it, a rising warmth, a quiet energy stirring in the air. He woke each morning with the sun, his feet finding the path to the river almost without thought, and each day the water seemed to carry a new song, sometimes a bright rush like laughter, other times a low hum like the memory of a dream. The stone had grown warmer with the season, and sometimes at night, when he held it in the darkness, it pulsed so gently it felt like the heartbeat of the forest itself. One morning he returned to the oak and found the clearing transformed. Where snow and frost had been, now lay a carpet of new life. Tiny white flowers, star-shaped and trembling in the breeze, small birds flitted from branch to branch, singing as though the whole world had been waiting for this exact morning to speak. And at the base of the oak, where he had planted the tuft of fox fur months ago, a single golden sprout had emerged, not like any plant he had seen before. Its leaves shimmered faintly, as if they held sunlight. Even in shadow, he knelt in the soft soil, his fingers brushing the delicate leaves, and a wave of warmth flooded his chest. It was not pride or possession, but something softer, deeper, like recognition. He whispered softly, "You made it," and the wind stirred the branches overhead, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The fox appeared again, as if summoned by the moment, stepping lightly into the clearing, its fur now sleek and rich after the winter. It walked to the sprout and sniffed gently. Before looking at the man with those molten gold eyes, there was an understanding there, an unspoken agreement that what had begun would now grow into something neither of them could fully imagine. Days slipped into weeks, and the golden sprout grew taller. Each morning he found new leaves unfurling, like slow, careful gestures of trust. The villagers began to notice changes they could not explain. The soil near the forest edge grew richer. Crops planted there sprouted faster and stronger. The river ran clearer, fish more plentiful than in years. The air itself felt lighter. Children laughed more, and even the elders walked with a softer step. They whispered that the man was blessed, that the forest had chosen him. He said nothing. He only listened and kept planting what he carried. One afternoon, as he sat at the oak, watching light filter through the leaves, he heard footsteps in the clearing. A young girl from the village stood at the edge, clutching a small bundle of flowers, her eyes wide with curiosity. He smiled gently and motioned for her to come closer. She hesitated, then stepped into the clearing. The fox appeared behind her, as if to guide her, and she gasped softly at the sight. He showed her the golden plant, and she knelt in the dirt, staring at it as if it were a star fallen from the sky. "Can I leave these here?" she asked, holding out the flowers. He nodded, and she placed them carefully at the base of the oak. The wind rose, just slightly enough to make the flowers tremble, and the girl's face lit up with wonder. She looked at him and whispered it, said thank you. Then she ran back toward the village, and he felt something expand in the air, a ripple moving outward, as if the forest itself had smiled that night. He lay under the open sky, the stone pressed against his chest. And he thought of the girl, of the villagers, of the river and the fox, and he realized that the miracle is not the plant, not even the stone, but the way the world had begun to speak. In a language everyone could feel, even if they could not hear it. The weeks that followed were a season of silent miracles. The plant grew taller, its stem strong, and smooth leaves gleaming in morning dew, and small golden blossoms began to appear, catching sunlight in their petals like droplets of honey. Animals came to the clearing more frequently now. Birds, foxes, even deer, all moving with a strange reverence. None disturbed the plant, they only lingered as if drawn by its light. One dawn, he found the fox curled at the base of the oak, asleep, its body pressed gently against the golden plant. He sat beside them both, and for a moment felt that the entire universe had condensed into this single circle of trust, this single breath of peace. One evening, the sky turned violet and gold as the sun sank, and he felt the pull to walk beyond the river into a part of the forest he had never explored. He followed a path of light, as if the sinking sun itself was showing him the way. He came to a small hollow where water pooled like a mirror, reflecting the first stars of the night. He knelt beside it and saw his reflection, not as he remembered himself, but softer, his eyes bright, with a light that seemed borrowed from the forest, his skin touched by sun and wind, and something else, something like the breath of life itself. He dipped the stone into the water, and ripples spread outward, turning the reflection into a dance of light and shadow. He whispered, "I am ready," though he did not know for what. And in the distance, an owl called a low, gentle note that felt like an answer as spring deepened into full bloom. The villagers began leaving offerings at the edge of the forest, baskets of fruit, small carvings, bits of bread, and honey. They did not speak of it, but he knew. They felt the pull, the quiet hum that had taken root in the world. The golden plant grew taller than his knee and began to emit a faint fragrance, sweet and earthy like rain on warm soil. And one night, he dreamed that he stood in the clearing, surrounded by 1,000 golden plants, all swaying in unison to a song only his heart could hear. When he woke, the fox was beside him, and the first light of dawn painted the world in shades of gold and He knew the dream was not just a dream. It was a promise, a whisper of what was to come. Summer arrived like a slow exhale, carrying warmth that seeped into the soil, the river, the leaves, and even the stones beneath. His bare feet, the forest, seemed to hum with life, a soft, endless melody that only those who listened with their whole being could hear. The man woke each morning before the sun rose, walking the familiar path to the river where mist curled like smoke from a sleeping fire. And each morning he felt the world lean closer, as if eager to share its secrets. The golden plant had grown tall, now its blossoms, like small suns, swaying gently in the breeze, and the fox lay often at its base, like a silent guardian, its golden eyes reflecting. The morning light villagers began to follow him at a distance, leaving offerings, not just at the forest's edge now, but in the clearing itself, fruits, flowers, and sometimes just smooth stones, painted with care. He never asked them to do it, and they never asked why they did it, but the world listened and seemed to smile through every gesture. He found that the air carried a quiet joy, like an invisible fragrance that filled the heart rather than the lungs, and the whispers grew stronger. Not in volume, but in presence. He no longer needed the stone to hear them, though he still kept it close as a friend. One day, a child from the village wandered into the clearing, holding a broken wooden toy. The child looked up at him with tearful eyes and said softly, "Can you fix it?" He took the toy into his hands and felt the weight of it, light and worn, and as he ran his fingers over the cracks, he felt something pulse in his chest. Not magic, not command, but a listening. He closed his eyes, breathed, and placed the toy in the circle near the golden plant, and the fox padded over, curling around it as the sun moved through the sky. The child waited, sitting cross-legged in the grass, watching the wind dance through the leaves. When the day ended, the man returned the toy to the child, its cracks, smoothed edges, soft and whole again. The child gasped, hugged the toy, and then him, and ran back toward the village without a word. The man looked at the fox, and the fox looked at him, and he felt the pulse of the forest move like a soft wave through his bones. That night, he walked to the river under a sky crowded with stars, each one a drop of quiet fire. The river mirrored them so perfectly, it felt as though he was walking between two skies. He whispered, "Thank you to no one and to everything," and the wind rose, carrying his gratitude into the trees. He began to notice that animals followed him, not only the fox, but small birds, rabbits, even a deer that trailed quietly at the edge of his path, as if drawn by the hum of his heart. One afternoon, he found an old man from the village standing at the edge of the clearing, leaning on a staff, his eyes wide and wet with awe. The man beckoned him closer, and he stepped into the clearing with slow reverence. "I had to see," he said, his voice shaking. "I had to know." The man said nothing, only smiled and motioned for him to sit. The old man knelt in the grass and wept. Silently, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming weight of wonder. He placed his wrinkled hand on the soil near the golden plant and whispered, "I can feel it," and the forest seemed to hum in agreement over the next weeks more. Villagers came silently, sometimes leaving offerings, sometimes only kneeling in the grass, as if the act of being there was enough. The golden plant had grown taller than his waist now, and its blossoms glowed faintly as though storing sunlight. To feed the night, the fox often lay beneath it, eyes half-closed, tail flicking lazily, but always alert. The man began to dream more vividly, dreams of rivers running into paths of light, dreams of seeds sprouting into entire forests, overnight dreams where the wind carried whispers of people he had never met but somehow loved. When he woke, he felt as if the dreams were not separate from the day, but threads of the same vast weaving. One evening, as he sat at the river watching fireflies rise like sparks into the twilight, he felt the stone grow warmer than ever. He held it in both hands and closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his eyelids he saw the forest, the river, the village, all connected by glowing threads that pulsed with each heartbeat. He felt himself dissolve into that web until he could no longer tell where he ended and the world began. When he opened his eyes, the fox was sitting in the river, its paws in the water, its reflection rippling like a fragment of starlight, and he understood without words that the forest knew him and he knew the forest, and that they were not two, but one. Summer deepened, and the miracles became so gentle they were almost invisible. Crops flourished, the river never ran dry, the air felt softer, the night's safer laughter in the village carried farther like a bell rung across hills. Even those who never stepped into the clearing felt it. The old man who had wept returned one morning with his granddaughter. She knelt in the grass and whispered to the golden plant, and it swayed as if in response. She clapped her hands and said, "It said hello," and the old man laughed, a sound like dry leaves warmed by sun. And in that moment, the man knew the world was truly listening, and that it had begun to speak to everyone who dared to believe. One night, under a silver moon, he walked through the village and felt the whispers ripple through the quiet streets, like a song he had always known but never heard. Until now, he saw lanterns glowing in windows, shadows moving softly inside homes, laughter carried on the warm summer air, and he realized the forest's hum was now the heartbeat of the village itself. He held the stone to his chest and, for the first time, whispered aloud to the stars, "I am not alone," and the night answered with a breeze that smelled of pine and wildflowers, wrapping him in a soft, invisible embrace. Autumn returned like an old friend, carrying gold in its hands. Leaves blazed in shades of amber and fire, and the air turned crisp with the promise of rest. Yet the forest did not sleep. The golden plant had grown taller than the man now. Its blossoms, luminous even in shadow, and their fragrance filled the clearing like a memory of sun after rain. The fox lay beneath it, often its fur touched by drifting leaves, and sometimes the man would sit beside it, both of them silent, as if guarding a secret. The whispers had grown so deep they no longer needed words. He felt them in his bones, in the rhythm of his breath, in the quiet joy that spilled into everything he touched. The villagers now visited the clearing, openly bringing children, elders, and even strangers from distant towns, all of them stepping softly as though entering a temple. They left offerings in the circle of soil, and sometimes simply sat with their hands in the grass, their eyes closed, their hearts open. The men welcomed them, not with speech, but with presence, and in that presence they felt whole. One day, as the sun broke through a veil of clouds, the golden plant began to change its blossoms, shifting from small suns into clusters of light so bright they seemed to hold the very dawn in their petals. And then, one by one, they released their seeds into the wind, golden and weightless like sparks rising from a sacred fire. The wind carried them beyond the forest, into the fields, the riverbanks, the village, and beyond. The man watched as the seeds floated across the sky, carried by currents. He could not see, and he felt a soft ache in his chest, not of loss, but of fulfillment. He knew, without doubt, that each seed would plant itself where it was needed most. He followed the path of the seeds to the river, where their reflections turned the water into a river of stars that flowed both ways, as if time itself had bent to witness this blooming that cued night. He dreamed that the entire world glowed, threads of gold connecting forests and mountains, cities and deserts, and each thread hummed with the pulse of life, his own heartbeat echoing in every leaf and ripple. When he woke before dawn, he walked barefoot through the dew-soaked grass and found that the golden plant had withered, leaving only a tall stem like a memory. He knelt, touched the soil, and felt the hum still alive, deeper than roots. He whispered, "Thank you," and the wind answered with a sigh that felt like a hand on his shoulder. Over the following days, the villagers noticed the change. They found golden sprouts near their homes, in fields and gardens, along paths. They had walked all their lives without looking down, and the sprouts grew fast, their blossoms bright with a soft heat that made the air itself feel alive. Laughter rang louder, food tasted richer, and even old wounds seemed to heal, not just in bodies, but in hearts. The man spent more time by the river than ever before, watching the water carry light into places he would never see. Sometimes children joined him, bringing stones and feathers to add to the circle at the oak, and they would sit in silence together, feeling the hum that now lived in everything. One evening, the fox appeared at his side, its fur glowing in the last light of sunset, and without a sound, it walked with him to the edge of the village. There he saw lanterns lit in every window and golden plants blooming softly in courtyards and gardens. Villagers stood quietly in their doorways, some holding hands, some with tears in their eyes, and they nodded to him, not in worship, but in shared knowing. He nodded back, feeling the hum rise in his chest like a song he could not contain. The next morning, he woke to find the stone on his chest pulsing. Stronger than ever, he held it in both hands, and for the first time felt it dissolve into warmth, into light, until it was gone. And yet it lived in him, in every step, every breath, every glance at the sky. He walked to the oak and sat beneath it, the clearing alive with soft golden light from new blossoms sprouting in the circle of soil. And he closed his eyes, feeling the world breathe with him. Seasons turned, leaves fell and grew again. Snow came and melted, rivers froze and thawed, and through it all the hum never left. He had become the hum, the forest, the river, the golden bloom, and the village thrived, not in noise or wealth, but in a prosperity so quiet it could be mistaken for peace. Children listened to the earth, and planted with their hearts. Neighbors shared without keeping count, and even the sky seemed to bless the land with gentle rains and warm sun. One day, a young woman from the village knelt beside him, her hands in the grass, her eyes bright with wonder. She whispered, "How do we keep this forever?" And he smiled, soft as the river's mist, and said, "The forest is always listening." And the wind carried his words like seeds into every heart, into every branch and ripple and stone. And in that moment, the man knew the hum would never die, because it was no longer his alone. It belonged to the world, a quiet song of eternal prosperity that would bloom wherever there was someone willing to listen. Autumn returned like an old friend carrying gold. In its hands, leaves blazed in shades of amber and fire, and the air turned crisp with the promise of rest. Yet the forest did not sleep. The golden plant had grown taller than the man now, its blossoms luminous even in shadow, and their fragrance filled the clearing like a memory of sun after rain. The fox lay beneath it, often its fur touched by drifting leaves, and sometimes the man would sit beside it, both of them silent as if guarding a secret. The whispers had grown so deep they no longer needed words. He felt them in his bones, in the rhythm of his breath, in the quiet joy that spilled into everything he touched. The villagers now visited the clearing, openly bringing children, elders, and even strangers from distant towns, all of them stepping softly as though entering a temple. They left offerings in the circle of soil, and sometimes simply sat with their hands in the grass, their eyes closed, their hearts open, them not with speech, but with presence, and in that presence they felt whole. One day, as the sun broke through a veil of clouds, the golden plant began to change its blossoms, shifting from small suns into clusters of light so bright they seemed to hold the very dawn in their petals. And then, one by one, they released their seeds into the wind, golden and weightless, like sparks rising from a sacred fire. The wind carried them beyond the forest, into the fields, riverbanks, the village, and beyond. The man watched as the seeds floated across the sky, carried by currents he could not see, and he felt a soft ache in his chest, not of loss, but of fulfillment. He knew without doubt that each seed would plant itself where it was needed most. He followed the path of the seeds to the river, where their reflections turned the water into a river of stars that flowed both ways, as if time itself had bent to witness this blooming. That night he dreamed that the entire world glowed, threads of gold, connecting forests and mountains, cities and deserts, and each thread hummed with the pulse of life, his own heartbeat echoing in every leaf and ripple when he walked barefoot through the dew-soaked grass and found that the golden plant had withered, leaving only a tall stem like a memory. He knelt, touched the soil, and felt the hum still alive, deeper than roots. He whispered, "Thank you," and the wind answered with a sigh that felt like a hand on his shoulder. Over the following days, the villagers noticed the change. They found golden sprouts near their homes, in fields and gardens, along paths they had walked all their lives without looking down, and the sprouts grew fast, their blossoms bright with a soft heat that made the air itself feel alive. Laughter rang louder, food tasted richer, and even old wounds seemed to heal. Not just in bodies, but in hearts. The man spent more time by the river than ever before, watching the water carry light into places he would never see. Sometimes children joined him, bringing stones and feathers to add to the circle at the oak, and they would sit in silence together, feeling the hum that now lived in everything. One evening, the fox appeared at his side, its fur glowing in the last light of sunset, and without a sound it walked with him to the edge of the village. There he saw lanterns lit in every window, and golden plants blooming softly in courtyards and gardens. Villagers stood quietly in their doorways, some holding hands, some with tears in their eyes, and they nodded to him, not in worship, but in shared knowing. He nodded back, feeling the hum rise in his chest like a song he could not contain. The next morning he woke to find the stone on his chest pulsing stronger than ever. He held it in both hands, and for the first time felt it dissolve into warmth, into light, until it was gone. And yet it lived in him, in every step, every glance at the sky. He walked to the oak and sat beneath it, the clearing alive with soft golden light from new blossoms sprouting in the circle of soil. And he closed his eyes, feeling the world breathe with him. Seasons turned, leaves fell and grew again. Snow came and melted rivers, froze and thawed, and through it all the hum never left. The golden bloom and the village thrived not in noise or wealth, but in a prosperity so quiet it could be mistaken for peace. Children grew into adults who listened to the earth and planted with their hearts. Neighbors shared without keeping count, and even the sky seemed to bless the land with gentle rains and warm sun. One day, a young woman from the village knelt beside him, her hands in the grass, her eyes bright with wonder. She whispered, "How do we keep this forever?" And he smiled, soft as the river's mist, and said, "The forest is always listening." And the wind carried his words like seeds into every heart, into every branch and ripple and stone. And in that moment, the man knew the hum would never die, because it was no longer his alone. It belonged to the world, a quiet song of eternal prosperity that would bloom wherever there was someone willing to listen. They lived at the edge of a quiet village where the fields met the forest, and the wind always seemed to carry more than just air, carrying scents of pine and earth and something softer that lingered in the spaces between thoughts. And though their home was small, it was filled with the gentle warmth of a life built slowly over time. He was called Elias, and she was called Mara, and though they loved each other in the quiet ways of people who had shared seasons together, there was a space between them that neither spoke of, for Elias believed that the world listened to those who listened to it, while Mara believed that the world simply turned cold and indifferent, and that life was made only of what you could hold in your hands. They had lived this way for years without naming the difference until the day the old traveler came through the village and left behind a small wooden box. He had white hair like drifting clouds and eyes like deep water. And he said little, but smiled as if he had already heard a joke no one else had caught. And when he placed the box in Elias's hands, he said, "Plant it where the wind feels alive." And he left without waiting for questions. Mara had frowned at the box and asked, "What is it?" And Elias had shrugged, "I think it is a gift." And she had shaken her head, saying, "Gifts like this are only stories, and stories don't grow." But Elias had felt the weight of the box and the warmth that seemed to hum from inside it. That night, while Mara slept, he opened it, and inside was a single seed, black and smooth, with tiny golden specks that shimmered when he turned it in the light. He held it in his palm and felt his heart beat slow, as if the seed was listening. The next morning, he walked to the edge of the forest, where the wind curled through the tall grass like invisible fingers. He knelt and pressed the seed into the earth, his hands trembling with something he couldn't name. And he whispered, "Grow." Mara watched from the doorway of their small home, her arms crossed against the morning chill, and she shook her head, saying, "Seeds like that don't grow." "You'll see." Elias only smiled and said, "Maybe it will listen." Days passed and nothing happened. Mara teased him gently, at first saying, "Maybe it's sleeping," and then more sharply, "You see? This is why hope is foolish." Elias watered the patch of soil each day, speaking to it softly, sometimes just sitting beside it in silence. And at night he dreamed of roots winding deep into the earth and stars bending low to listen. A week later, a sprout appeared, small and fragile, with a faint shimmer in its veins. Elias laughed aloud, and Mara felt a shiver in her chest, though. She told herself it was the wind. He knelt beside the sprout and whispered, "Thank you," and the sprout seemed to sway as if in response. Mara stood at the edge of the field, staring at the tiny living thing. And for the first time she wondered, not with belief, but with the smallest spark of curiosity, what if? The nights grew longer and the air cooler, and Elias began leaving small stones and feathers near the sprout as offerings, while Mara watched him from the window, feeling torn between love and doubt. One evening, she walked out to him under a sky heavy with stars and asked, "Why do you do this?" And he answered simply, "Because it listens." She shook her head and said, "It's just a plant. And he smiled and said, "So are we." And for a moment, her chest ached with something she couldn't explain, as if a memory of hope had tried to bloom. The next morning, they woke to find the sprout had grown twice its size overnight, and its leaves caught the light in a way that made the entire clearing glow softly. Mara touched one leaf and felt a warmth travel through her fingertips, and though she pulled her hand back quickly, that night she dreamed for the first time in years of something other than chores and days. She dreamed of rivers flowing with golden water and seeds falling like stars, and in the dream she heard a voice that might have been the wind, whispering, "Everything listens." The mornings grew softer as the sprout reached higher, its leaves wide like small hands catching the light. And Elias rose before the sun each day to sit beside it, speaking softly, not with questions, but with the kind of words that bloom from gratitude. And sometimes he said nothing at all, simply breathing in rhythm with the quiet earth. Mara watched him from the doorway, a shawl around her shoulders, telling herself she only stayed to make sure he wasn't wasting time. Yet her eyes lingered on the way the sprout seemed to move in the wind, even when the air was still. One afternoon, a child from the village wandered over, drawn by the faint shimmer that now surrounded the plant, and she knelt in the grass with wide eyes, asking, "What is it?" And Elias only said, "A gift." The child touched one leaf and laughed, saying, "It feels warm, like the sun is hiding inside." Mara frowned, but that night she couldn't sleep, because the sound of the wind outside their window seemed to carry whispers she couldn't quite understand. Over the next weeks, the sprout became a small tree, its trunk smooth and dark, with veins of light running through it like rivers under the skin. Elias began arranging stones in a circle around it, and he noticed that animals started to come. A fox at first, then birds that landed on its branches without fear, and sometimes even a deer that grazed nearby. Mara said it was coincidence, but her voice wavered as she said it, because part of her had begun to dream too. Dreams of walking through fields where gold drifted through the air like dust. And she woke each morning with a feeling in her chest, like a door had opened a little wider. One evening, as the sky turned violet and the first stars appeared, Elias whispered to the tree, "What do you need?" And though no voice answered, he felt a warmth rise through his hands into his arms. And he smiled. The next day, he saw something extraordinary. The soil around the base of the tree had shifted, and tiny golden sprouts had begun to emerge. Not many, only 3 at first, and each one glowed faintly like embers. Mara stepped closer than she ever had before, crouching to look, and she felt a strange pull in her chest, a memory of herself as a girl pressing a seed into the dirt behind her old home. A seed she had forgotten. She whispered, "I don't understand." And Ilias said softly, "You don't have to. Just listen." Mara stayed by the tree that evening longer than Ilias, tracing the leaves with her fingertips and breathing in the faint fragrance they gave off like rain on warm soil. That night, she dreamed again, this time of walking through the forest with Elias. But in the dream, he carried light in his hands and scattered it like seeds across the earth. And everywhere it touched, flowers rose and hummed softly. She woke before dawn and went outside. The grass cooled against her feet, and she stood beside the tree while the mist curled around its branches. And in that stillness, she thought she heard a voice, or maybe a memory, say, "All things answer when you listen." From that day, Mara began leaving small offerings beside the tree, too. A feather, a smooth stone, a bowl of water. And though she told herself she didn't believe, her hands trembled with a quiet hope she couldn't hide. The village started, whispering about the strange glow at the edge of the forest, and some came to see it, leaving in silence with softened eyes. And in the evenings, when Elias and Mara sat side by side beneath the tree, they no longer spoke of belief or doubt, only listened as a wind carried secrets through the leaves. And for the first time, Mara began to feel that the world was not empty. After all, the golden tree grew taller with each passing day, its branches stretching towards the sky as if they were remembering a promise, and the small sprouts around its base began to shimmer softly even in the daylight. Elias noticed that the air near the tree felt different, warmer and lighter, as if the wind carried not just air, but possibility. He spent hours there, hands in the soil, whispering words of gratitude, while Mara lingered closer than before, sometimes pretending she was only passing through. Yet her fingers always brushed the leaves when she thought no one was looking. One morning, they woke to find that the golden sprouts had bloomed into small flowers, delicate and luminous, and each one gave off a faint hum like the vibration of a distant bell. Mara knelt and listened, feeling her heart respond with an unfamiliar rhythm. And though she still hesitated to speak her thoughts, Elias saw the way. Her eyes had softened, as if a light had opened behind them. Days became weeks, and subtle changes began to appear in their lives. Elias had always carved small wooden trinkets to sell at the village market, and though they were simple, the week after the flowers bloomed, he sold every single one. People approached him saying they felt drawn to his work, as if the little carvings carried warmth. Mara noticed that the hens laid more eggs than usual, and the small vegetable patch behind their home produced more than it ever had. And when she walked through the village, strangers smiled at her in a way she couldn't explain. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Elias sat by the tree and said, "It's working, Mara. Can you feel it?" And Mara hesitated. Her hands clasped together before whispering, "I feel something, but I'm afraid." Elias asked softly, "Of what?" And she said, "Of believing and losing." He reached for her hand and said, "Maybe belief is what makes it stay." She didn't answer. But that night, she dreamed of holding a small golden seed in her hand while the wind swirled around her, whispering words she couldn't quite understand. And when she woke, she felt as if the dream had left something behind in her chest. The next day, a sudden storm rolled through the village, dark clouds twisting above the forest, and the rain fell hard, beating against their roof like fists. Mara felt panic rise in her chest, imagining the golden tree broken or washed away. She wanted to run to it, but Elias held her hand and said, "Wait, trust." The storm raged through the night, and when the sun returned the next morning, they ran barefoot through the wet grass to the edge of the forest, and what they saw made them stop in wonder. The tree had grown taller overnight, its branches heavy with golden leaves that dripped rain like liquid light, and the flowers around its base had multiplied, their hum louder now, harmonizing with the soft rush of the wind. Mara pressed her hands to her chest and whispered, "It's alive." Elias smiled and said, "So are we." And in that moment, she felt the first true bloom of belief inside her, a fragile but undeniable warmth. That evening, as they sat by the tree in the soft afterglow of the storm, fireflies began to gather around the branches, their small lights joining the golden hum, and the couple felt, for the first time together, that the world was listening. As summer deepened, the golden tree became the heart of their days, its branches wide enough now to cast a shimmering circle of light upon the grass, and the hum of its flowers had grown steady like the heartbeat of something ancient Elias spent. Each dawn their whispering gratitude, and Mara joined him most mornings now, though she still carried the quiet tremor of someone learning to trust. The village had taken notice, and whispers spread quickly. Some said the tree was a blessing. Others muttered about strange magic, and one evening an old neighbor came to their door, his face lined with worry. He said, "Things like that do not belong to people like us." And Mara felt her chest tighten, because part of her still feared he was right. Elias simply smiled and said, "It belongs to those who listen." and he closed the door softly. Yet that night, Mara lay awake, hearing the wind outside their window. And for the first time, the whisper felt like a question instead of a comfort. The next morning, they found that one of the golden flowers had wilted. Its glow faded to pale silver. Mara knelt and touched it gently, her fingers trembling, and a sharp doubt pierced her chest. She turned to Elias and said, "What if they are right? What if this is wrong?" Elias felt the fear in her voice and paused, looking at the tree and then at her. He said softly, "The tree grows on love, not fear, and if we let fear take root, it will wither." Mara closed her eyes and tried to hold on to the warmth she had felt before. But doubt has a way of speaking loudly in quiet hearts. The next few days, the sky darkened again, not with rain, but with the heavy stillness of storms that hold themselves back. And Mara's unease grew. Villagers began to stop by, curious, some bringing small gifts to leave near the tree, others only staring with suspicion. One young man scoffed, saying, "It is just a trick of the light." And Mara felt the sting of his words more than she wanted to admit. That night, she dreamed she was standing alone in a field of gold. But the wind was cold and carried whispers she could not understand. She woke before dawn and found herself walking to the tree, the air thick and quiet. She whispered, "Are you real?" And in the stillness, the leaves rustled as if answering. But the doubt in her heart twisted the sound into uncertainty. The following evening, a stronger wind rose, bending the branches of the tree, and Mara watched from the doorway, while Elias went outside, holding the trunk with his hands as if to steady it. He called into the wind, "We are here, we believe," and the wind seemed to soften for a moment. Yet, in the morning, they saw that 3 more flowers had fallen. Mara sank to her knees and wept, fear and guilt heavy in her chest. Elias knelt beside her and said, "It listens to us, always, and now it is listening to your fear." She looked at him through tears and whispered, "I don't know how to stop." And Elias held her hands and said, "Then let me believe for both of us." That night he sat under the tree alone, his voice steady, whispering gratitude for every leaf, every fallen flower, every breath they shared. And as the moon rose, Mara joined him, her hand slipping into his. Silent but present, and in that quiet, the wind began to hum again, soft and low, carrying a promise neither of them could fully hear. Yet the sky began to shift, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. And the villagers sensed it to the air, thick with a quiet electricity. For 3 days, the wind whispered through the trees in a language that felt almost human. And Elias rose before the sun each day to sit under the golden tree, his voice low with words of gratitude, while Mara lingered nearby, silent but listening, her doubt like a shadow that had grown lighter but not yet gone. On the fourth day, the storm came, not like the last one with its furious rain, but with a wind that carried both song and warning. The sky was a swirl of gray and gold, and the air smelled of earth and lightning. The tree bent but did not break, its leaves shivering with a strange joy. Eli stepped into the wind and lifted his arms, whispering, "We are ready." Mara hesitated at the doorway, fear tightening her chest, but then she ran to him, her shawl flying behind her like a wing. And when she reached him, he took her hands and said, "Feel it." And for the first time, she let herself stand still in the wild air, letting the wind press against her skin. And she felt the hum of the tree vibrating through the soles of her feet. The storm lasted hours, the world reduced to wind and light, and the steady pulse of the golden tree. And when it finally passed, they stepped back and saw what had changed. Around the base of the tree, the fallen flowers had not died, but transformed, their petals now resting in the soil like coins of light, and from each petal a new sprout had begun to rise, small and shining. As if the storm had planted a second circle of life, Elias laughed, his voice breaking with awe, and Mara fell to her knees, touching the glowing sprouts with trembling fingers, whispering, "It listened, it listened." The next morning the village came to see, drawn by the soft light that spread across the clearing like dawn, even before the sun had risen. And one by one the villagers knelt, leaving offerings of bread, feathers, small handmade things, and Mara watched them with tears in her eyes, feeling the strange weight in her chest dissolve that night. As they sat under the tree, with a new sprout humming softly around them, Mara leaned against Elias and whispered, "I think, I believe." And Elias smiled without opening his eyes and said, "The world has been waiting for that," in her next dream. Mara stood in a field where the sky itself bloomed with golden flowers, and for the first time she picked one and held it close to her heart, and the wind whispered her name like a blessing. When she awoke, she felt the warmth in her chest as if the dream had left a seed behind. From that day forward, she spoke to the tree too, not as often as Elias, not as easily, but with the tender voice of someone who had finally decided to open a door inside herself. And the tree seemed to respond, its glow stronger, its hum fuller. And in the evenings, the fireflies returned, in greater numbers, their tiny lights weaving constellations between the branches, as if the sky itself was beginning to bow to their belief The days that followed felt like living inside a slow and gentle sunrise. The golden tree now stood taller than their home, its branches wide and heavy with leaves that glimmered in soft waves, and the circle of sprouts around its roots had grown into a radiant little forest of their own, humming softly as if sharing secrets with the wind. Elias noticed how everything around them seemed to respond. The soil in the garden turned richer, vegetables grew sweeter and larger, the hens produced more eggs, and the air carried a fragrance of earth and honey. Mara woke each morning with a new calm in her chest, a warmth that reminded her of the dreams she had been having, dreams of walking through endless meadows of golden light, sometimes holding Elias's hand, sometimes alone, and each time the wind whispered, "Trust," and she felt lighter when she woke. The villagers came more often now, some bringing gifts, some just to sit in silence. And one evening, an old woman placed a tiny wooden bird beneath the tree and whispered, "For the first time in years, I dreamed again." Elias smiled at her, and Mara felt something shift inside, realizing that what they had planted was no longer just for themselves. The prosperity that grew from the tree began to touch the village quietly. Fish were easier to catch, fields began to recover, and even the laughter of children sounded brighter. Mara found herself singing while cooking, a soft song she didn't know she remembered, and Elias would listen, smiling. As the tree hummed in harmony one late afternoon, when the sun painted the sky with colors too soft to name, Elias said, "I think the tree is waiting." Mara tilted her head. Waiting for what? And Elias looked at her, his eyes reflecting the light. "For you to believe fully." Mara inhaled slowly and walked to the tree, resting her forehead against its trunk, and for the first time she let her thoughts pour out like water. Every fear, every small joy, every wish she had buried beneath years of silence, and as she whispered them into the bark, she felt a pulse under her skin, warm and alive. That night she dreamed of herself planting seeds that glowed brighter than the stars. And when she placed her hands in the soil, she saw her reflection in the golden light, smiling back without fear. In the following days, something extraordinary began to happen. Small fruits started forming among the golden leaves, round and warm, glowing faintly like embers. Elias touched one gently and said, "It's ready." But the tree seemed to speak in its own way, because the fruit did not fall. Instead, the wind carried the scent of them across the village, and people came with offerings again, drawn by something they could not name, and each time someone left with a lighter heart. The fruit seemed to glow a little brighter. Mara realized then that the prosperity the tree brought was not gold or coins or things you could hold. It was the feeling of life expanding in ways that touched everyone it reached. And in that understanding, her belief finally rooted itself, deep, unshakable. And the next morning, they found the first fruit on the grass, warm and humming softly, as if alive. The first fruit rested in Mara's hands like a small sun, warm and steady, its glow pulsing softly in rhythm with her breath. She held it against her chest and felt her heart respond, a quiet expansion she could not explain. Elias watched her with the patient smile of someone who had always known this moment would come. And as the wind moved through the golden branches, it seemed to sing her name. That night, they placed the fruit on their simple wooden table and lit a candle, sitting in silence, feeling as though the whole house breathed with them. Mara whispered, "What do we do with it?" And Elias said, "We listen." The next morning, they found the fruit had split open on its own. And inside was not seeds nor flesh, but light, a soft golden mist that rose and filled the room with warmth. And when the light touched their skin, they both closed their eyes, seeing visions of their life, not as it was, but as it could always be, full and unafraid. In the days that followed, more fruit appeared, each one glowing brighter than the last. And with every fruit, the village seemed to change. People came to sit under the tree, sometimes leaving in tears, sometimes in laughter, but always lighter. And soon, the suspicion that had once lingered in their eyes was gone, replaced by something like wonder. Mara began to notice that she no longer feared the wind or the whispers. She walked barefoot to the tree each morning and greeted it as if greeting an old friend. And the tree seemed to answer, its leaves singing in soft harmonies that only she and Elias truly heard. The harvest of the golden fruit became a ritual, each fruit opening in its own time, each one releasing light that healed more than the eye could see. And the villagers began to share stories of dreams that felt like guidance, of fields that thrived, of long-held sadness dissolving in the quiet of night. Elias and Mara watched their simple life expand in ways that could never be measured in gold. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of copper and rose, Mara turned to Elias and said, "I remember when I was afraid, softly, not in mockery, but in joy, and said, that fear is what made the belief so precious. The tree had grown to its fullest now, its topmost branches touching the sky like threads of light, and one morning they woke to find the fruit no longer appearing on the grass. Instead, The tree itself seemed to pulse gently, the glow of its leaves brighter than ever, and Elias understood. It had given all it needed to give, and now it simply was a living mirror of everything they had learned. On the last night before the first frost, the entire village gathered under its branches, the wind calm and warm despite the season. And Elias spoke to them, his voice steady. This tree was born from a seed of belief, from a whisper carried by the wind, and it grew because we learned to listen, to love, and to let go of fear. Mara took his hand and added softly, "The true harvest is here." And she pressed her free hand to her heart. The villagers closed their eyes, and for a moment, the entire world felt still. Listening, the fireflies rose in swirls like sparks from an unseen flame, and above them the sky bloomed with stars that seemed to echo the golden light below. In that sacred stillness, Mara realized that the prosperity they had been given was not a gift to hold, but a way to live. And as she rested her head on Elias's shoulder, the golden tree hummed one final soft chord, a lullaby of wind and light. And the world answered with silence, the kind of silence that feels like forever.